Super Mario. We all know him. He's the fat guy who jumps and goes. You've probably owned a Mario game at some point in your life or know someone who has, but tell me this, what's the first thing you notice when buying a Mario game? Or rather, any video game at all for that matter? The music? The title screen? Sure, maybe, but I was more so referring to the first thing you see, that being the cover art. You ever just buy a video game and kind of just stare at the cover? I mean, half the time what's on the cover looks 10 times better than what's actually in the game. Hear me out. You're 8 years old, you just got home from a long day of school, and your mom says she'll take you to pick one game out of your choice. So you get there, and at this point, you're analyzing every game you see, trying to figure out which game you want to take home. All you really have to go off of at this point is, well, the box art. What are you going to do? Read the box? So let's say you finally pick out a game, and at this point, you're pretty excited. I mean, look at that cover art. The graphics must be insane. Look, the point I'm trying to make here, when you're going to buy a video game, you kind of hope what's on the box is relatively similar to what's actually in the game. I mean, if it's not, then that's just false advertising at that point. However, due to limitations in the early 80s, this was sort of just not possible. Games were being made with pixelated 8-bit graphics. Of course, they'd make the cover art stand out a bit. As long as the cover art conveyed to the player, hey, I'm just cover art and nothing more, then it was fine. In most cases. One company that was dominating the video game market around this time was Nintendo. Who would have guessed? However, the first game to really get them going as a video game developer was, of course, Super Mario Bros. On the NES. And they actually broke the trend of misleading cover art. What you saw on the cover was what you got in the game. Nintendo was proud of what they developed and they weren't ashamed to show it off front and center, all in its pixelated 8-bit glory. However, that's not to say Nintendo stayed with this trend or even started with it. See, Super Mario Bros. On the NES was actually originally released on the Famicom in Japan, and as you can see, they used hand-drawn 2D illustrations for their cover art. They would continue to do this for the years following, and they even adapted that into their international releases as well. It kind of just made sense to go with this rather than this going forward. I mean, it just looks way cooler too. So for every Mario game released, a new load of artwork was shown off alongside it, but whether that be the box art itself or inside the included instruction manual. Can't forget about merchandising too. How are you going to buy your Mario toothbrush without artwork of Mario next to it to advertise? However, as time went on and the technology started to evolve, so did Mario. The year was 1993. 3D graphics were the hot new thing, so Nintendo wanted to take their shot at it. However, the technology was just not quite there yet, so they had a workaround to solve this issue. Enter Silicon Graphics Incorporated, a computing manufacturer who would go on to make these super powerful workstations, as they were called, to create high quality 3D renders. One of the earliest examples of this would be with Rare, the company behind the Donkey Kong Country series. They had purchased one of these SGI workstations to produce 3D pre-rendered models for Donkey Kong Country. Due to the Super Nintendo's graphical limitations, they would have to heavily compress these pre-rendered 3D models into little sprites that can move in the game as you play. These would use sprite sheets, similar to every other game released around this time. However, since the graphical limitations mentioned before had no effect on the actual box art, they make 3D renders specifically for advertising purposes. And yeah, they looked really good. Sure, maybe a bit dated now, but for 1993, this kind of thing was unheard of. Using higher quality 3D renders for promotional use would go on to be the standard for all of Nintendo series going forward, and Mario was no different. Square Enix would later use the same technology to create Super Mario RPG in 1996 for the Super Nintendo. And with it, we'd get our first Mario game with 3D graphics. This wasn't our first time seeing Mario in 3D, however, because a few years prior in 1992, Nintendo would partner with Sim Graphics to develop a little thing called Mario in Real Time. And with it, we'd get our first look at Mario in 3D. And it's interesting, to say the least.
I ain't got nobody. Get it? Nobody?
I can't give them too much hate given the limitations at the time, but this thing was just nightmare fuel. I will say though, the Mario in Real Time stuff is insanely charming and super ahead of its time. And this is even when Charles Martinet started to voice the character, so hey, that's pretty cool. Also, he should have voiced Mario in the movie. Going back to Super Mario RPG, however, this is where we get our first batch of 3D renders for Mario, and they honestly look really well made. You can tell this game was going for more of a chibi or cutesy art style here, and it shows with Mario's chubbier proportions. Another honorable mention here would be Big Yoshi. I mean, just look at him. This wasn't meant to be the standard for Mario in 3D going forward, rather a unique spin on the character for this game and this game only. And honestly, I quite like it. Seems like fans did too, because Nintendo would end up keeping this design for the remake on the Switch almost 30 years later. Though, as stated before, this design didn't stick around. Moving on, around this time, Nintendo had just unveiled their first 3D console, the Nintendo 64. Then known as the Ultra 64, this was their first console to have real-time 3D graphics. So from around 1995 to 1996, we'd see some earlier renders of Mario to help promote Nintendo's next system. One of the first renders we'd see originates from an issue of The Ultimate Gaming magazine, issue 78. And wow, he looks sunburnt. This was made by Rare, so Nintendo is thankfully not to blame for this monstrosity. Going into Nintendo-made renders, however, the first model we'd see would be this one. Later in Nintendo's 1996 company report, we can see a slightly refined version of the model. Something to note about this model in particular is that we actually may have original concept drawings of it. As shown at the Shinoki Cultural Complex held in 2020, we can see Yoichi Kotobe's artwork here, which looks very similar to this pre-64 render of Mario. It just gives us a better look of how the team at Nintendo were able to take Mario's 2D design and translate that into 3D. There's not much else to say regarding the model other than the fact that it would be used as Mario's file select icon in Mario 64. Speaking of, enter our first official era for Mario renders, also known as the N64 era. Anything before this point, we'll just call pre-64 era just to make things simpler. The game to start this era would be, of course, Super Mario 64. Being the launch title for their new console, this game had a lot of eyes on it, and Mario looked like this. Yeah, not very appealing. Even though we would finally move to a point where 3D models can be controlled in real time in video games, the technology was sadly still not quite there for the 3D renders on the cover art to look like their in-game counterparts. So, using Silicon graphic workstations, Nintendo would go on to create 3D promotional renders for the game, as well as a brand new model for Mario, making its debut on the box art for the game. This style would stick around for quite a while, and even be used up until the mid-2000s for some promotional material. But man, this design just looks really good. You can tell Nintendo really took their time when translating Mario's design into 3D. As seen in the manual for the game, there were just so many different poses they could do with the guy, and honestly, they all look great, even today. Sure, maybe a bit dated looking, but I think that's just what gives them their charm. I know a lot of people have a soft spot for this era, and I mean, heck, an entire team used this as their basis to completely remake the game visually from scratch. Crazy stuff. In this game, we'd be introduced to new render models of Toad, and of course, the King Koopa himself. A favorite render of mine from this game would have to be this iconic shot of Mario vs. Bowser. So much iconic artwork originates from this game, and they cooked hard with this one, so it makes sense why they'd keep this style going forward for the next few years. Definitely not my favorite era, but I can see why so many people love it so much. Moving on from Mario 64, the next game to be released with a new batch of 3D renders would be Mario Kart 64. Now, nothing much to say about Mario, Toad, or Bowser, given they all retain the same promo models from Mario 64. We'd get to see some of the first 3D renders for the remaining Mario cast. This would include Luigi, Princess Peach, Yoshi, and Wario. They all look great and fit in very well with the rest of the cast established models from Mario 64. Now, something interesting to note here is the renders seen in the character select screen of the game are actually completely original models. Well, from Mario and Luigi at least. For the others, it's kind of hard to tell. I'm not sure why this is, but it's a cool little detail, I guess. Let's see. The next game here would be Mario Party. And for some reason, they changed the models again, but they also didn't? Yeah, so a lot of the promo renders for this game, including the box art, retain the style established from Mario 64. However, some artwork, you can see Mario and gang sporting original models once again, and I don't know. They don't look bad, but I can't really see a reason to replace the models yet again, just to go back to using the old ones in the next game. Who knows, maybe Hudson Soft made these models because they did develop the first 8 Mario Party games. Either way though, the renders from this game look quite unique, and I do like the different scenes of the cast doing different mini games. They even go to remake these scenes for Mario Party Superstars on the Switch. Would also love to give a quick honorable mention to this render of Toad where he has legs for some reason. I don't know whose idea this was, but I'm kind of glad it exists. Alright, one last game here to cap off the N64 era would be Mario Tennis, released in 2000, where we'd see new renders for both Daisy and Waluigi. I just find it really cool how Waluigi was created at the very tail end of the N64's lifespan to warrant getting a promo model in this style. Sucks it was only used for 2 games though, that being Mario Tennis and Mario Party 3. Over the next few years, we'd see tiny little changes to Mario's model, but nothing major to really mention here in this video. This was basically the Mario model you think of during this era of games. That was, however, until Mario's model would see a complete overhaul. Let's not get ahead of ourselves though, because this design would stick around one final time in 2001 for Super Smash Bros. Melee. Yeah, so apparently Melee started development in the late 2000s, so it only makes sense as to why Mario would be sporting this design still. As you can clearly see, due to the more realistic art style Smash was going for, Mario was given more realistic textures on his clothes, as well as a darker color palette than usual. However, one game that was released a couple months prior would change everything. The year is 2001, and with it we had gotten the release of Nintendo's new console, the Nintendo GameCube, and with it we'd see a huge improvement in terms of graphical capabilities. Now Mario can properly emote in the game, and it definitely shows. This is where we'd see Mario's design truly form into what we know it to look like today. The first game to kick off this design was Luigi's Mansion. No promotional renders of Mario actually exist for this game, however you can see Mario's updated design within the game itself. As you can see, Mario's design looks a lot more refined and clean. I don't want to focus on in-game models too much, so moving back to just promotional renders for now, you can see Luigi's design here is sort of resembling his N64 look, just with some minor changes here and there. The next big game to continue this new standardized look for Mario would be, of course, Mario's big new outing for this console generation. And with it, we'd see a whole new batch of promotional renders to look at. And wow, they really outdid themselves here. Mario looks better than ever, and I'm personally really happy with the design changes they went with here. While N64 era Mario has a certain charm to him, this is what I think of when it comes to Mario. Though, given when I was born, that's probably a bit of bias on my end. Anyway, with this game, we'd see a new promotional models for Princess Peach, Toad, and of course, Yoshi, and a few others. Something neat here is they actually give Peach a unique dress for this game to match the summer vibe, and it looks really cute. I really wish Nintendo didn't just get rid of it after this game. Another highlight is just how good Toad and Yoshi look here. Sure, they don't look much different from their modern designs, but I think people really take for granted how much the GameCube era really standardized a lot of the designs for the franchise. Next up, we get a proper look at Bowser's render model, and I say proper look because in Luigi's Mansion it looked like this. Also, we can't forget about Bowser Jr. given this was his debut game and all. After Mario Sunshine, we get the release of Mario Party 4, the first game to give us a look at the new designs for Luigi, Daisy, Wario, Waluigi, and Donkey Kong. Up until this point, DK sort of kept his rare design, seen in games like Donkey Kong Country and Donkey Kong 64. However, they changed his design to match the rest of the characters' new looks. I really like the changes that they made here. Again, when you think of DK, this is the design that probably comes to mind, unless you're like old or something, I don't know. A standout render during this time would have to be this one of Mario sporting a tribal tattoo, promoting the special edition tribal Game Boy Advance SP. Not much to say here, I think it's just kind of funny. The overall design of Mario in this era has barely changed, even to this day. However, that's not to say other characteristics of his renders have stayed the same. For example, around the end of the GameCube era, we'd see sort of a noticeable change to Mario's renders, specifically in his clothing. As you can see, they went for sort of a realistic approach, adding creases and wrinkles to his clothing. But starting with Mario Power Tennis, they got rid of his detail altogether in favor of a more clean look. They also kept his overalls very simple and honestly a lot better looking, opposed to the painted on look that they went for in his earlier GameCube renders. Speaking of things being painted on, you can also see that with most of the renders around this time, his mouth was sort of just added in post, which is fine, just sort of funny when you notice it. They actually still do this trick to this day for a lot of his modern renders, but over time they learn how to make it look less obvious. Another change is that his ears are actually fully modeled now and not just a flat texture plastered onto them. Now, I'm not sure if you've noticed this pattern yet, but it seems like with every major console generation, Mario would get a new look. However, heading into the Wii era, the changes became less noticeable. For example, looking at a render of Mario from Mario Party 7 to Mario Party 8, there isn't too much of a difference here. Though, if you know me, I spend way too much time analyzing Mario renders, so I'm here to tell you that there are actually some differences they made going into the Wii era, that being light bouncing. As you can see here with this Mario Party 8 render, the red of Mario's shirt is actually bouncing onto his skin, which isn't the case in earlier renders. The Wii era also just improved significantly in the lighting department. I'm not sure why, but every render in the GameCube era just looked sort of dark and overly shaded. It did go kind of hard though. Due to Nintendo making Mario look more refined, this is easily the simplest Mario's ever looked, though I don't really see that as a bad thing. I mean, they pulled off the look very well. Can't talk about the Wii era without bringing up Super Smash Bros. Brawl. They decided to do a complete 180 and made Mario look the most realistic he has ever looked up until this point. This was done so characters like Solid Snake wouldn't clash with the overly saturated Yahoo Man. Another standout from this era would have to be both the Galaxy games. Since they both took place in space, they gave Mario this very strong rim lighting, which looks super cool and helps the game's artwork stand out. A favorite of mine has always been this one of Mario and Yellow Yoshi from Galaxy 2. Easily up there in terms of my favorite renders in the entire series. And weirdly enough, Mario Party 9 of all things would also carry over this strong rim lighting for some of its renders too. Now, Nintendo is keeping Mario's brand very safe around this time, and that was very apparent in his renders too. And yeah, it works really well here. I love how clean everything looks. This was Mario, no doubt about it. Though we would see some very minor changes to Mario's render model around this time, specifically around the time the 3DS was coming out. Super Mario 3D Land being a prime example. While Mario looks mostly the same, you can tell he looks a bit more soft. It's hard to put into words, but you can see little tweaks to his design, like how his mustache isn't as sharp and it's more rounded out. He also just looks a little chubbier with a less pronounced chin. These very subtle changes weren't for nothing, however, since they would go into making the perfect Mario model, which is a model used for reference of different types of Mario merchandise. So toy makers and of the like have the perfect reference to go off of. And another interesting thing to note here is that the model used in the 3DS era is very similar to the one being used to this very day. That leads me to the Wii U era, the era that would go on to become the most common and widespread render style of Mario seen today. Starting with Super Mario 3D World for the Wii U, you can see the jump in render quality here, and it looks really nice. Every character has sort of a Pixar look to them. Another thing to note here is this is when they start giving Mario and gang actual detail in their renders. An example being, you can see the individual stitching in Luigi's hat here, as well as the boot material on Toad's shoes. Do you need to see this? Well, no, of course not, but I think it's kinda cool regardless. This is the first time a mainline Mario game went out of their way to add detail like this. 3D World would only be the start, however, since they would go on to refine the style more with later games. This brings me to probably one of the most important games I have to talk about today. The game that would single-handedly decide on a render style for Mario that would still be used to this very day. That game being, of course, Mario Kart 8, being released in May 2014. I say of course, but most people probably don't know that. This game's promotional renders were actually done by Marza Animation Planet of all things. Yes, that Marza Animation Planet. Or at least they're credited for working on the 3D models, which doesn't really make a lot of sense because these are the same 3D models used in every other Mario render, but I'm just gonna say Marza made the renders, I don't care. Marza absolutely cooked with these renders. I mean, just look at how good and expressive everything is. Imagine a timeline where Marza animated the Mario movie instead of Illumination. That's the timeline we sadly didn't get. This game would continue the trend of adding realistic details to these renders, and most of the textures and materials used for this game are actually still being used to this very day as far as I can tell. Some things would change very subtly, like Mario's M texture on his cap, but for the most part, the render style introduced in this game is nearly identical to the modern day renders. Which leads me to believe Marza may have actually helped out the current render model that we see today. Maybe not the model itself, but potentially things like the textures and materials. I also just love the lighting they use for Mario Kart 8's renders. Everything just looks so clean. Easily one of my favorite render styles so far. They cooked so hard with this one. Moving on, we have Mario Party 10, another fantastic example of Mario renders. They took what worked with Mario Kart 8 and went with it. This is also the debut of Mario's modern hat emblem. Not that it really matters, but it's a little too late to be complaining. I also really like this iconic render of Peach. It just looks really good. I don't know, there's just something about this game's renders that stick out to me. The colors just pop and you can really see the difference between this and what came years before. This is when Nintendo really found their footing with Mario renders, and I'm really glad the style is still going strong today. The remainder of the Wii U era wouldn't really change much at all after this. Games like Super Mario Maker, Mario Tennis Ultra Smash, and Super Mario Run, they all kept the same style established for Mario Party 10, albeit with some minor changes here and there. And as I mentioned before, this style is still going strong today. However, this would not be the last iteration we'll see of Mario's render model. That honor would of course go to Super Mario Odyssey, released in October 2017. Earlier that year, in January 2017, we did get the Nintendo Switch Live presentation, and with it, new footage of the game, as well as promotional artwork to go alongside it. And it looks really good, surprisingly. If you told me the next iteration of Mario is gonna have individual hair strands and pores on his face, I'd be scared. But no, they actually pulled it off very well here. Mario's given much more detail than usual, with denim overalls and all. In 2019, Nintendo would actually go on to release an art book titled The Art of Super Mario Odyssey, and in it, we'd get a pretty detailed insight from the developers as to why they made such a big change to Mario's appearance. As stated by art director Rikuto Yoshida, he'd go on to say the following: "When considering Mario's design for this game, we decided very early on to give the physical materials a more realistic look than before. In order to welcome players with the aforementioned sense of surprise, we made individual strands of Mario's mustache and hair visible. We also designed the denim of his clothes to show a fine weave." I'm not going to read the rest just because I highly advise you check out this book for yourself if you haven't already. It goes into so many cool details regarding the creation and artwork of the game, and it's definitely worth the read. I actually own this book myself, and I'm so glad I do. There's just something about owning it physically that hits different compared to just reading the PDF online or something. This game is sadly the only game to really take Mario in such a realistic direction. The game's following to keep certain aspects like his denim texture, but make his hair much more cartoony and flat. I wonder if this change was done due to the internet backlash the realistic hair got from fans, or if it was just simply to save money. I mean, come on, all this can't be cheap, let's be real. Nintendo would bless us with the occasional Mario eating a watermelon render, but bro, put the dogs away. But yeah, Odyssey was really the only game to go all in with the detail. And that leads us to present day. As I'm recording this, there are currently two render styles for Mario being used. Those being the less detailed Wii U era and the more detailed Nintendo Switch era. With the Nintendo Switch 2 being literally around the corner, anything can happen. Mario already looks a bit different in the small glimpse we saw of him in Mario Kart 9. Imagine if they updated his render model too. That'd be insane. Well, that's all I got for today. This video took me over a year to make, so I hope it was worth the wait. Check me out on Twitter if you want to see more from me. On there, I actually make my own renders and try to make them look as Nintendo accurate as possible. If you're into that sort of thing, I'll have a link down below. If you want more videos like this, subscribe so I know if I should make more or not. With that being said, I'm Shine, and I hope you all had a great Mario Day. See you later.